All right, everyone, when I was talking about rioting and so forth yesterday in the context of Bill Barr optioning sedition charges against violent protesters as the new rioter, against communists most of the time, and the cats are literally jumping over one another and doing backflips. It's quite a sight. You should see it someday. A little bit distracting, guys. Tone it down. I'm hyper-caffeinated today because when I saw the Ginsburg story, I decided to brew a second cup. But I decided that there was one part of that video that I needed to elaborate into a full video of its own. And that's the topic of the myth, the narrative that the left doesn't do crime and terrorism. Because you've seen these infographics posted about, like the Lincoln Project, which they're partially controlled by Russia. You do realize one of their founders has deep ties to Rosatom, which is a Russian energy firm, correct? Yeah, there's no conflict of interest there, considering that they have Russia derangement syndrome non-stop. It's actually really funny. But these groups, they're fond of posting these little infographics that are like, well, number of cases of terrorism in the United States over the last 10 years. It's like a bunch of cases of right-wing terrorism, and then it's like one for left-wing or Antifa or something. This is a lie by omission. It's also a lie by legalism. There are differentials within the legal system that people need to understand. Even like convictions on a racial basis, they do have a differential. People only like to acknowledge that when the differential is something that helps their argument. When it doesn't, they like to not mention it very much. The lie here is that Antifa and the BLM Marxists, other far-left groups, and if a BLM member conducts terrorism, I do not believe at this time that it's registered as far-left terrorism, even though they're a far-left political group. Antifa would be, but keep in mind Antifa. While they are not centrally organized at the national level, they are regionally organized, specifically in areas where DAs are friendly to their cause. The DA system in the United States in some areas has, yes, unfortunately been stacked in favor of far-left terrorism. If a far leftist builds IEDs and hurls them at police, they get taken in and the DA refuses to charge them, or the prosecutor sets no bail, lets them go, and they just go out and go rioting again. If there is never a conviction, will it be part of the statistics you're seeing from the SPLC, or the ADL, or the Lincoln Project? No, it's not going to be counted. There was no conviction. It was clearly far-left terrorism. It was clearly defined within a political context. Clearly a crime. Charges may have even been brought, but there's no conviction. Kind of hard to convict a person when you don't set bail and they just go back out night after night, racking up more crimes for which they're wanted but never actually fully get convicted of. If you have judges that are reluctant to bring those charges to fruition without dropping the case, well, there you go. You don't have a conviction. This does not happen for right-wing groups because there are very few DAs in the country that have been deliberately stacked in favor of a group you would define as right-wing. Also, you've got to understand that there's a difference, generally. There is a difference between the competence and corruption levels of inner city versus small-town, suburban community, sort of police, DAs, and so forth. There's a big difference. While in some one-horse towns you get the hillbilly sheriff with bad teeth protecting his rapist neighbor just because they drink together, you can get that as a problem. Corruption is far larger and more prevalent in inner-city situations. Just by structure, it's more hierarchical. You've got more money involved. There's more profit to be made. When you have 5 different commissioners and a dozen different police chiefs and these 10 precincts and the SWAT teams and stuff, when you get all of the tactical stuff and the 7- and 8-figure budgets, it's a lot different than having a sheriff and a couple of deputies part-time working out on a ranch somewhere. The corruption level tends to be greater, and therefore if you're going to get corrupt judges, prosecutors, cops, and so forth, they tend to be in metropolitan areas. Suppose, and the funny part is whenever they go in, the far leftists, and try to reform what's happening, this problem is never solved now, is it? It's just like poverty in the inner city. They pump more and more funny money into the situation, give people more breadcrumbs, and they just get more and more poor, typically, because they tax out the productive classes, and then the money dries up, and then they have to tax people even more. It's a Detroit death spiral sort of thing. The narrative is only true if you look at convictions. If you look at actual crimes, that have been charged rather than things convicted of, where a reasonable person would suspect that the crime had actually been committed and the person should be in a cell. When you look at that differential, it's totally different. And then there's the other problem, which is that the federal statistics don't appear to be actually included in some cases. Why? Because when the federal police go in, their jurisdiction trumps the state and the local cops, and then they can put them through the federal court system. And it's totally different. That's not run by Soros prosecutors, I guess. So yeah, I've debunked that narrative fairly thoroughly. If you don't have a conviction, it's not a statistic. If you have two different groups of people, or two broad overarching groups, right wing, again with quotations, or left wing, again sometimes in quotations. If you have these two groups, but you fiddle around with the numbers to exclude BLM from far left, to add religious motivation to far right, unless it's Islamic, which typically is done in these cases. Yes, if you add abortion clinic bombers into the mix and assume that they have far right politics, shit, the person could be a communist that just happens to be a religious zealot, who's sort of confused about things. Or they could have no political leanings whatsoever. I would argue that a lot of evangelicals at this point, they're not on the Trump train at this point, I think. I think that's beginning to dissipate. The Pat Robertson days are steadily decreasing. Again, though, if you're basing it off of conviction data and you have prosecutors and judges that are negligent in their duties, and Antifa knows which cities it can safely riot in because it literally knows who the prosecutors are, that's one of the main underpinnings of the organization, is taking advantage of a lax legal system. Knowing that they can literally throw shit at the cops, break into businesses, loot, shoot, and kill, and it doesn't really matter because there are never any consequences for their behavior. And when the rioting dissipates, they just go back to their tendy basement. They go back to their swimming pool full of honey mustard sauce and their infinite tendy vendors on their parents' credit card, or their grandparents at this point. Most of these people look like they're pushing 40. That's about all. Peace out.